Right. We are here. We're back again. We're here with Charles. How are you doing today, Charles?
I'm well, thanks. And yourself?
I'm doing well. I noticed you had an appearance on television, or the telly, as you guys call it. I love the intercultural difference. I feel like, I'm personally kind of an open borders guy. So I always think of Canada and Britain and Australia and these other English speaking countries as like provinces of an island archipelago country. Like we're all one country. We have this bureaucracy that's keeping us apart. But that's what I think is like a really valuable cultural heritage stuff, the richness of the accents, because that's generally when a language develops in a place, then that's where you get the rich kind of diversity of accents. Like compared to if you go to the United States and you go from like North Dakota to Washington State, it's just like everybody talks the same because it's all recent migration and it hasn't had
Mm.
time to differentiate. Have you given any thought to sort of linguistics and memetics as a field? I'll ask you kind of a fun question is, do you think 200 years from now that the English language will be more conservative, meaning that it will resemble current English more than English from 200 years ago, or do you think that it will radically change and that we won't be able to understand the I almost said slargon. The jargon and the slang will be so different. Do you think technology, for example, will accelerate changes in language, or that it will be a conservative effect on language?
I haven't given the topic much thought,
But if
but
a gun was put to your head and you had to make a prediction,
I suspect there would be a lesser diversification of language in 200 years' time than over the last 200 years because there's so much migration within the United Kingdom today relative to the past. And as you've mentioned, this great mixing is what leads to homogenization of language. And insofar as a greater homogenization of language is a lesser diversity, a lesser change of it, then we're going to get lesser change than in the last 200 years, where you had local communities that were in some cases, well, actually, no, I suppose 200 years ago, you did have free movement within the country. But if you go back a little bit before that, then there was quite a lot of regulation or restrictions on welfare, which meant you couldn't actually move, or it was very difficult to move, which created these local communities where language and accents could evolve and produce their own words.
yeah, I sort of asked that it's not a gotcha question, but it's kind of a surprise, spontaneous question. And I think that the reason I like linguistics and looking at linguistics and syntax and the evolution of that is because I think it gives us a basis to think about other sorts of social rules like morality. So, like, why do we consider veganism and vegetarianism? You can think about that from first principles and you can try to figure out whether that's a moral position to take. But the average person on the street doesn't necessarily, they're either not interested or not capable of having a first principles discussion. And so a lot of their moral behavior is regulated by custom and fashion. And so the evolution of morals over time seems to be a parallel phenomenon to the evolution of language. But maybe if I would actually agree with you that I think language in 200 years will be more conservative, less change than we've seen in the past. But I think morally, actually, that's kind of a contradictory case because I feel like there's going to be a lot of evolution and trying to figure out, why is that? Why might there be more moral evolution over the next 200 years versus the past 200 years? And maybe you might dispute that characterization, but I think it's an interesting way to think about morality, not as a first principles argument, but almost looking at it from a syntactical, mimetic, evolutionary perspective of what is the dynamic. Maybe to add, a practical real world example is I was speaking with a friend about Obama versus Alan Keyes in the senatorial race in America. They were debating gay marriage. This was back in like 2004, 2006 or something. And it was remarkable to me because I thought, something like that really hasn't happened since. You haven't had two politicians sit down and have a philosophical debate from first principles, and people watch that debate. Alan Keyes, I don't remember the phraseology, but it's something like, where reproduction is in potential possible, then marriage is permissible, or he has some kind of like formula like that. And Obama's trying to engage with him, and they have equal time. We don't do that with politicians much anymore. It's more the interview format of, you've got an interviewer, they ask questions, the question is short, the guest gives a long answer. You don't have that sort of equal time back and forth. Newsom and DeSantis had a debate, but I think it was more ad hominem, like, you're a corrupt politician and you're for the people, and I'm against. They weren't talking about first principles. They weren't talking about, is gay marriage moral in itself from first principles? And that sort of discussion, maybe we'll have some podcasters like Destiny will become a senator in the future, and we'll look back on that and say his debates online kind of like impacted politics. But I know you've gone on the street, I think recently, with cigarettes and tobacco. Can you tell me a little bit about your street activism? What's going on with that?
Since January of last year, I have run the grassroots campaign against the tobacco ban here in the United Kingdom. And I've taken this campaign, which is primarily rooted in an opposition to paternalism on the basis of liberal grounds, across the country, from East Grinstead in the south to Oxford, which is north of East Grinstead, to London, Witney, and Haywards Heath, and other such places. And I've gone out and I've spoken to normal people and put forward the liberal argument that if individuals should be free to make mistakes in all areas of their life concerning, say, not studying for exams or overeating or overdrinking, then for the same set of reasons, they should be free to smoke themselves to death. And I've had some really interesting discussions with members of the public, but the vast majority of the sponsors are not interested, mate. Or I'm not a smoker, so don't really care about this issue, which always strikes me as strange, because I think, well, you're not a nurse, but you're still interested in NHS policy. You're not typically a person that has their house on fire, but you probably still take an interest in what's done with the fire department in your local area. But on this issue, it's not interesting, mate. Usually politely, I will say that. The vast majority of people that I've met have not been rude at all.
Yeah, I wonder the variation on that. So it's like, in order to have a moral discussion, there's a presumption. There's almost a moral presumption going into the discussion that having a moral discussion in itself is a productive use of time, or like there's some kind of utility that we can change minds, and then gradually that affects policy and so on. And that makes sense within the context of a democracy, or even kind of going back before, not even looking at that form of government as governing the state, but in terms of like congregational churches, right, where individual members of the church have a voting right in terms of who the pastor, presbyter, whatever the term would be. So they have, and you can still, if you go to American churches today, Baptist churches, different types of churches, you'll have like the board of the church, and they will vote on, should we hire a gardener to plant a shrubbery out front or something like that. And the pastor, of course, is part of that. But it's interesting to me maybe that the political, like the interaction between the political form of democracy and the moral presumption that having a philosophical discussion is a good idea, versus maybe going all the way back to like Athenian democracy and the Socratic dialogue, and the idea of, well, we've just lost a war to Sparta, and we've had these experimental forms of government, and now we've gone back to democracy. Are we going to keep this? In what form? How should our religion be constructed, and so on. So there's certainly do you think, and another big kind of question is, do you think that having like an aristocratic or oligarchic form of government where only a few people can vote, only a few people have power, do you think that would encourage a more philosophical culture? Because people would actually feel like, in order for philosophy to have utility, it has to have an impact on policy. And the best way for that to happen is I really only have to change a few people's minds. If I could just change the mind of the king or the council or whoever it is, then I can get somewhere. Whereas when you have a mass democracy and you're out on the street, I find it very entertaining. I'm not trying to discourage you from going out and doing that, but I find it personally discouraging myself. I've gone out in I had a friend, he had a company, and so we had these bags of crickets, and we were out on the street, and we were selling bags of chocolate crickets to people. And, I'm engaging in these salesman tactics to people, and I realize, there's an art of sales. And I feel like when you're on the street, sometimes the art of sales wins out over the art of philosophy, and that can be a tragedy. So I wonder, kind of, how do you feel about the state of democracy, and how do you think that impacts our philosophical culture?
Before 1832 in this country, only property owners could vote in elections. And I suppose if that franchise was returned, insofar as those people are more likely to be philosophical, more likely to see themselves as being the type of person that should engage in philosophical arguments and form their policy preferences on those beliefs, then perhaps you would find that public discourse would be influenced more by philosophical discussion, or just discussion generally, as opposed to appeal to base urges or self-interest, which I imagine those that don't hold property are more susceptible to give into, although that verdict is made in no great study of the evidence. It's just a thought that I have. Does philosophical argument work, art of sales? It's certain. I've read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and I think I have subconsciously put that into action in hearing people out when I go and talk to them on the street. I think certainly listening to people and letting them speak their piece and then making your interventions very helpful in persuading people to your position, because they feel like they're being heard. And I genuinely do hear them out. I mean, usually I predict what they're going to say, because I've heard it all before, because I've spoken to lots of people, but I still make an effort to focus on what they have to say. And I think you can persuade people via philosophical arguments. Certainly you can correct them on the facts. A number of people in this country believe that smoking costs the NHS or the state a net amount of money, and that for that reason it should be banned. But it actually creates £14 billion of net benefits to the Treasury, because you've got a £10 billion cost which isn't incurred because they die early, £9 billion of tax revenue, and about £5 billion worth of expenditure on tobacco-related treatment for cancer and picking up litter. So £14 billion benefit. And people were very confidently saying, oh, we should ban smoking because they cost the NHS money. And I give them these figures, and then they're suddenly, oh. So you can correct people on the factual points, and that can change their mind because they just realize that they're wrong, and that nobody's questioned me on those figures. And I think when you do point out the inconsistency of people's position, it does make them think twice. And I imagine I have swayed a few people. It maybe not over the line to agreeing with me, but certainly reduce their confidence that they have in their paternalist beliefs. I have got people to go, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that before, and I've documented that on my Substack.
Yeah, I guess, you made that point about who's more likely. Are there different types of people who are constitutionally more likely to listen to a philosophical argument? And I accept your presumption on that without evidence. But I would even argue that if there were no constitutional differences, that every individual was equally likely at a random chance to be amenable to a philosophical argument, I would still have the question of whether a more limited franchise would encourage a more philosophical culture, because I think that there is a conception of utility in the philosophical argument, and that the conception of utility is at its greatest when you're dealing with an individual over means where the proportion of power is greatest. So if you're speaking directly to the king, maybe not your king, but a theoretical ideal Platonic king, right? You're speaking to the Platonic king, and the Platonic king has infinite power. I mean, it sounds like God at this point, but you're speaking to the Platonic king, and you have an audience with him. And so, what sort of arguments are you going to make? I mean, you could try some sales tactics on him. You could try to appeal to his self-interest or whatever. But he's the king. He already his self-interest is satisfied in a number of ways. And if you wanted to prove to him that actually, no, this policy, banning smoking or rescinding the ban, whatever, this policy is better for your self-interest, you kind of have to make a philosophy. It's very hard to appeal directly to his self-interest. Maybe if he's a smoker, he's not a smoker, but you could always say, well, I'm the king, so I have an exception to the ban, right?
Mm.
So, when you're talking to someone who's immeasurably powerful, it seems that you almost have to make less self-interested arguments. Whereas if you're talking with someone who's very powerless, the man on the street who has one vote out of millions of votes, it's like, in order to capture that person's attention, it seems like there is going to be an incentive to use sales tactics rather than to say, well, look, I already know you're very powerful, and so let's put self-interest aside. Let's just talk about the good in the abstract sense, or the good for the whole society. And so that's why I think even ignoring the constitutional argument, meaning that, which group of people is more amenable in their sympathies, just in terms of you could take a random person and make them king. And I think once you empower a person, they are more likely to listen to philosophy, whereas when you disempower a person, they're more likely to listen to sales. Because there's almost like, people will say that power corrupts and like power makes you more selfish. But I'm skeptical of that argument. I think it might be the inverse. I think that actually when you're really, when you have a sense of disenfranchisement, yeah, you're much more hungry for enfranchisement, whereas when you already have the power, I think actually you're kind of more interested in, like, the gentleman scientist of the Victorian era, who's just kind of like, putting all his money into these weird experiments that don't have any like tangible direct benefit to him, but he's just kind of like experimenting because he has the free time and he's just interested in it. So yeah, I don't know if I can prove that as a generalization, but it's kind of an interesting thought experiment and what that means. I don't know if you have further comments on that. We can also jump into animal rights, because I know we've had a bit of a back and forth on that as well.
I'm happy to do that.
So we were talking specifically, should we kill foxes in order to save,
Yeah.
rabbits and prey animals and things? And you have this kind of, and I've heard this argument before, and I'm not sure I fully understand it. So maybe you can help clarify it for me. But my understanding is that, one measurement of the good and utility is suffering and pain. And so we know that if an animal gets torn limb from limb, and if you've had a cat and you've seen what it does to a mouse, it'll put the mouse in its mouth and it'll let it go, and then it'll chase it down, and then it'll claw it at it. And, the mouse has a real hell of a time with the cat. It's not a good situation. Tom and Jerry is not a nature documentary. It's actually much more grim than that. So we understand that the mouse is experiencing suffering and pain. And so, one thing you could do is you could say, well, let's kill all the cats, and then the mice won't experience that anymore. But I think you kind of introduced this hunter argument, which is that, well, if a population of prey animals overpopulates, then it will begin to outstrip the resources in the area, and then they will die these slow, painful deaths of starvation. And so actually some degree of predation or hunting is warranted because it reduces the net suffering. And so, looking at that, I think on its own merits, I guess I can kind of be sympathetic to elements of those arguments. But then when we start getting into the idea of like, the act of the cat or the act of the fox in hunting is a sinful or immoral act that we should prevent, we should intervene to prevent it. That seems to me, my intuition goes off and I say something's gone wrong. We have to, we kind of have to let nature take its course and accept the cycle of things. And if that requires I have to do some spooky voodoo magic and insert some Deus Ex Machina to justify that, then I guess I'm willing to examine all the options in that regard. But can you kind of explain maybe where you think I might be going wrong, some things I might be missing, or where we stand on that?
I think you've you've misread my article, and a number of people have actually when I've spoken to them about it. So I'm not a utilitarian. I've got Peter Singer's animal liberation here, but that's not the argument that I buy for animal rights to the extent that he believes in animal rights, which he doesn't really. So I'm accepting in my article the vegan case for killing animals, the animal rights position of Tom Reagan and David McGrazier. And they say that animals have a right to life. And I'm just accepting that for the moment, that it's immoral to kill animals. But if you take the Grazier, he says when you're dealing with animals, you can advance their interests. It's permissible to say keep a dog in your house, restricting its natural freedom in a certain way, provided you advance its interests relative to its natural condition. The natural condition being that which it is entitled to. So the reason why you can operate on a dog, causing it quite a lot of pain, say if it's broken its leg, is because the advantages of the operation outweigh the disadvantages relative to the natural condition to which they're entitled to, which is just having the broken legs. So it's permissible to inflict the pain because the benefits outweigh the cost. So I take the example of ducklings. Now, in the wild, ducklings have a mortality rate of 30% in the first 30 days of their life. So what I say is it's in their interests to be farmed in certain cases if the farmer, say, slaughtered only 25% of them at 60 days, because each one of those ducklings in expected value terms would have its interests advanced. And if we take having your interests advanced as a kind of consent, it is the proxy for consent, because of course animals can't consent, then all of them consent to this farming, which involves a quarter of them being killed, because that's better than being mauled to death by foxes or eaten by birds in a natural condition. So I'm saying, even on the strict animal rights view that you cannot kill animals, it will always be permissible to kill some animals, and it will be permissible to kill animals where you keep them in conditions and then you slaughter them, but you slaughter them at a rate lower than the natural level to which they're entitled. So you couldn't slaughter more than 30% of the ducklings at below 30 days of their life, because then they'd be better off in the wild. But given that's not the case, you can slaughter ducklings, you can slaughter ducks, you can slaughter pigs, you can slaughter a very limited number of cows. So the vegan is always going to be committed, even on animal rights ground, to allowing for the slaughter of a few animals. And that's what I wanted to show in this piece.
So there are three objections I have. One is regarding human intention. One is regarding dignity, and what was the third? We'll just start with the two. So human intention. This would be the argument that it is wrong for humans to kill animals because we have some kind of special ability for free will or intent or so. We have some kind of distinct moral duty or burden that animals don't have. And so if a fox kills a duckling, nothing bad has happened in these moral terms. Now, would most people accept this on an intuitive level? Probably a lot of people, if they saw a duckling being killed by a fox, they would have an urge to intervene to save the duckling. Some people would cheer on the fox. Some people would be neutral. But I would kind of take the side of, if we're to take a moral intentionalism seriously, which is that an immoral act can only take place if there's an immoral intention behind it, then only humans are capable of this. And therefore, we should regard the killing of a duckling by a fox to be a totally morally neutral act, as morally neutral as a rock falling off a cliff face or something onto another rock. It's an act of destruction, but there's no moral sin being committed. Whereas if a human intervenes and says, well, to reduce total death and total suffering, I'm going to intervene and I'm going to kill a few ducks, then because those were intentional killings by a human, by this moral agent, then now some sin has been committed, whereas before there was none, and so it's a net increase in sin. So that would be the first argument. The second argument I would make would be regarding dignity, saying, oh, and this, so the third argument was regarding antinatalism. So the dignity argument is that it is undignified for humans to domesticate animals in general. Now, you could maybe justify it on utilitarian grounds that, we can use hunting dogs and we can use these animals, and the utility outweighs the moral sin of the lack of dignity. But if you argue that, for instance, it's undignified to put a human in a prison, as I would maintain, and it's actually more dignified to kill a human than to put them in a prison, depending on the length of imprisonment, then you would also accept that it's more dignified for a duckling to be killed in the wild, even if it's very painful, than it is for a duckling to be raised in a domesticated environment. And that kind of leads to an argument number 3, which is the antinatalist argument, which would say that given the fact that we have domesticated animals who are no longer capable of surviving in the wild, therefore the moral thing to do would be to put condoms on all the ducks and let them peacefully sunset out of existence. And then we would have wild ducks who could survive in a dignified life in their natural habitat, or so on. Do any of those arguments appeal to you, or they just don't seem very convincing?
I totally agree with you that the fox eating the duckling is not doing anything wrong or bad. I would say it's bad for the duckling, though, to be eaten, and it's good for the fox to eat the duckling. And I must confess, I've seen a duckling, one of my ducklings, taken by a crow, and I did get very upset because I had a greater concern for the duckling, because I prefer ducklings to foxes. And perhaps if I had a gun, I'd shoot the fox. Although I probably wouldn't. I mean, my brother has a gun, and I wouldn't want him to shoot the foxes. So I agree with you entirely that the foxes are doing nothing wrong. You have to be a moral agent to do something wrong, to do something which is bad in terms of the act that's done. Now, you make this point about killing animals being wrong when humans do it because we have moral agency. I don't buy that, because I don't think animals have a right to life, and that will be my next Substack that's coming out on Tuesday. But just accepting Tom Regan and David de Grazier's argument for animal rights for the moment, I would ask you this question. Is it wrong to fix a dog's leg if it's broken it?
Because no one is dying, it could be okay. It could be okay to fix the dog's leg. But I'm not convinced that we don't have a moral duty to not kill animals. I'm still stuck on that one.
Okay, well, you had to read my piece. But I think most people would say it's permissible to inflict pain on the dog to make its leg better. And we'd say that's because it's in their interests. Now, we have to consider what level of interests are animals entitled to, because I don't think anybody really buys that they have a right to a decent standard of life, because then we'd have to intervene in the whole of nature and stop the predators from eating other things, and then supply the predators with an alternative. Nobody buys that. So I think the most plausible baseline of interest to which they're entitled is the natural level. And given ducklings in the wild, as I've mentioned, have a 30% mortality rate, if you kill them at less than that mortality rate and you bring them up in natural conditions, or as natural conditions as possible, like a big chicken net fence around a couple of lakes or something like that, then you're not setting back their interest to which they have a right. You're positively advancing them. So there's no violation of their rights here. And I think that should always be the concern. Inflicting pain upon an animal isn't per se wrong. And we see that in the example of fixing the dog's leg when it's broken. So we need to establish what the rights of the animals are. I think they most plausibly have a right to the natural condition to which they've been. We're not setting back their rights by killing them, because if we take an expected value approach, which we should, then we're positively advancing them. So I don't see any issue. Now, about dignity, I'm not really too sure about this. I can't see any problem with domesticating animals and allowing them to live a decent life. So I wouldn't want to put, say, pigs into what are the stalls called that they're typically in? farrowing crates, or broiler chickens in cages because they can't exercise their natural behaviors. But I think humane farming, certainly of beef, cattle, of lambs, all of this allows for their natural behaviors. So any dignity which they might be entitled to, which you might cash out, is being able to exercise your natural talents, is not violated at all. So I wouldn't have a problem with the humane farming to which I mentioned on the sort of dignitarian grounds that you outline.
Yeah, okay. So, with regard, you're making an argument concerning the welfare of animals and saying that if you prioritize the welfare of animals, then it is better to domesticate and farm these ducklings because the net death and suffering will be lower than in a natural environment.
Yeah, but only if you kill 25%. So no instances of duck farming today are morally permissible on the animal rights ground because 100% of them are slaughtered at 60 days and they'd be better off in the natural condition. But just accepting the animal rights position, yeah, killing 25% of them is fine.
Right. So we're presuming that our prime moral directive is we want to increase the welfare of animals. And what I'm going to do
I want to clarify that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's permissible to kill them when you're not setting back their interests relative to their natural condition. I don't think there's any moral obligation to advance the interests of the ducklings,
okay.
just not to set them back relative to the natural condition.
Okay. But I guess what I'm trying to communicate is that when we're running our moral calculus, we're asking, is this moral? Is this immoral? We're saying, is there net harm being done to the ducklings? And you're saying no, because you compare this environment to that environment. Clearly, this environment less harmful than that environment, therefore it's permissible. And what I would say is that we have to take out that calculation entirely. We have to completely disregard the welfare of the animal entirely. And instead, what we have to do is we have to look at the act of killing an animal on the human and ask whether and how that act is perceived. Now, there's a lot of arguments we could make. We could make a dignity-based argument. We could make a utilitarian argument on the grounds that I believe that people who kill an animal, that's more likely to create some kind of mimetic contagion where then people are more likely to murder each other because they think it's okay to kill an animal. Right. So what I'm...
Well, not Nozick, but cancer.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of arguments that you could make that we probably don't have time to get into. But I'll just say, if you assume that killing animals is bad for humans, not because it's like economically bad or because, some practical reason, but there's some mystical philosophical argument or whatever that killing an animal will cause some kind of moral stain on a human. And that's the only thing you care about. You don't care about animal welfare. You don't care about anything else. Then it still would not be permissible. And that's I guess the side that I end up falling on in this instance with regard to domesticated. Now, hunting, actually, I think that's a different category. And maybe I'm being inconsistent here, but I feel that, again, it's kind of this interlocking arguments concerning dignity is that because animals are hunted in the wild, in the natural habitat, then there's a difference in dignity between going out and hunting an animal and like capturing, domesticating animals and slaughtering them, even if it's only 25%. So maybe I've realized that there's so many layers of argumentation here, and maybe I've done an article on animal welfare before, and do animals have souls, and these sorts of questions, and probably there's a lot that I need to expand on that we've sort of uncovered here today, and you have some articles coming as well, so we'll be looking forward to that. Anything other than animal welfare, anything coming down the pipeline, some more protests over cigarette bans, or what's next for you?
I'm hoping to have an article published on the question of voluntariness and assisted dying. And I'm going to argue in that pressure on people doesn't invalidate the voluntariness of their choice to undergo assisted dying. So a lot of the cases that people outline and say, oh, well, this is making the choice involuntary because there's pressure on them to die. It's not the case. And then I've got an article coming out probably in about a month's time, or at the end of this month, on voluntary slavery and parental obligations, and whether if you accept enforceable parental obligations, you can consistently oppose voluntary slavery too. And maybe the next month I'll have something on a defending natural monopolies and the profits that they make.
Okay, well, we'll definitely be looking forward to that. I'd love to have another conversation with you at some point. I think we'll leave it there with a few minutes to spare. Charles, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed myself greatly.
Absolutely. You're welcome back on anytime. Take care.
Thanks.
Yep. Bye bye. All right.